I mean, I bought him his first real motorbike, when he was 7.
Right.
It was a real motorbike. I mean, it wasn't a, it was a real motorbike. I mean, you
What
could,
what
you know,
was
it
it? What I used to
was
have
an
one of those
idle
little
jet.
monkey. I used to have a little monkey bike. Is it one of those little small ones? Was it that sort of size? That's what they used to call them, monkey bikes. I think when I was
No,
when
no,
I
you
was
could
little.
take this on the on the road. You
Oh,
could take it.
really?
It was,
Okay.
oh yeah, it was an idle jet, a 50cc idle jet, and I brought him and Kimball one. Kimball was only 6, and I mentioned this to Kimball a few years ago, and he said to me, I said when I was looking at how he babies his sons at the moment, at that time, I said to him, gee, remember when you were 6, I bought your motorbike. He said, Dad, that was insane. That was totally insane. But at any rate, they were doing all that kind of stuff. Look, I mean, Elon and Kimball had been to, well, all of my kids, but generally, if you take Elon and Kimball, they'd been to just about everywhere by the time they were 10. I mean, they'd been to London, Paris, Rome. By the time they were 12, I think they'd been to the Far East, the Middle East, America, South America. They'd seen just about every place there was to see. And I spent what money I had instead of, I suppose, investing in some sort of trust or something, or whatever you call it, some annuity. I took my kids all over the world. And I even took them down Amazon on occasion, not the whole Amazon, just for
Right.
200
Right.
miles. And that was quite an experience. And so these kids, were exposed to all sorts of normal, I wouldn't say abnormal things, but sort of out there things. So I never really expected much from them. As I didn't think they would go. I mean, I'm stupid. I really thought that they would all just sort of always follow me around. I didn't really think that when they got older, they would sort of take off on their own type of thing. I didn't think of that. I never occurred to me. And I always thought they'd always be like, I'd always be supporting them or something. I don't know, quite know how I thought about it, but pretty soon I saw that I was quite wrong. And when they were about 23, 24, and they started their first business, I went over. I'd been trying to help them financially because it's very difficult from South Africa with the money situation here being so sort of messed up. But at any rate, I did send them money to help them with their first business, but it was ridiculously small, just enough for rental and stuff like food, I suppose. And then they suddenly got a $4 million injection cash from a company that publishes newspapers, because Elon went to them and said, "You're going in 1995." He said to them when he was like 24. He said, "You're going to have to go onto the internet, And nobody even knew what the internet was. Certainly in South Africa, we didn't have Wi-Fi in 1995.
Right.
Few people had it. They would have heard of it. And he went to them and said, "Look, you're going to have to go on the internet." And he convinced them. And quite frankly, I think a lot of people at the time would have said, "Look, what are you, stupid or something?" Because a lot of people were saying at the time, the internet is just a fad. It's just going to, it's going to go off like the CB radios or something like that. And Elon had the gumption to go to these people and say, "Look, if you don't go on," they published newspapers. They published 11 newspapers. If you don't do internet publishing, you're going to be lost. And they believed him. And they gave him $4 million in cash in 95, which I couldn't believe it. I said to him, "Look, take some of this money, like $200,000, and put it in South Africa. So in case you have to run away or something, They just laughed at me. But anyway, they turned that $4 million into about $500 million
Wow.
in a space of about less than 2 years. They turned it into, well, give it, say, 2.5 years to make it more. In 2.5 years, they turned it into about 500 million. Elon was very upset when they sold the company because he figured if they could have gone on, he would have turned that company into a $3 billion company.
Right. And
But
how did they do that? I mean, this was just in the early days of understanding the internet and so on and so forth. I mean, how do they get such a tremendous multiple?
well, what my children just arrived. They how did they do that? Yes, well, they Elon finished university in 94 or 93 or 94, 92, 93, somewhere there. And I said to him, "Look," and he said he wants to start a business. And I said, "Look, things are so tough here in South Africa. I can help you and Kimball, but I can't help just you and then later Kimball. So whatever you do, you got to include Kimball. And if you do well, because I'm going to have to sell my things here, whatever I've got at quarter of the value actually at the time.
Right.
I sold a yacht that I paid 400,000 for. I sold for 100,000 and sent them the money, but I had to, and so I said, I can't do it twice. So you're going to have to, if you do well, you have to look after your sister as well. So they sort of said yes, and then what Elon did was he spent an extra year at university in Pennsylvania doing a degree in physics. He used the credits he had, and he to do a course in theoretical physics after he graduated from Wharton, which is the top business school. Yeah. And he graduated from Wharton summa cum laude, which means top of the cum laude, sort of thing. And so he had this extra year that he messed about there. It's interesting that he did that because he then went to San Francisco. He got a job during the vacation. Very long vacations there. And he got a job during the vacation working for Pinnacle Research in San Jose. And they were researching batteries, deep cycle batteries that could be used in place of lead acid batteries. In other words, right. A capacitor, if you understand the term, the capacitor, like you have in electronics, as opposed to a battery, which would a capacitor can store energy, but not much, and so on. But anyway, Pinnacle was trying to work out a capacitor that could be so good that it could be used to power motor cars. And this was very fascinating to him. And it was that later on led him to look for those people. Years later, about 10 years later, to look for those people, and that he met in 1994, in 2004, to find out what had happened to their electric car. And that's what brought him to these guys who then moved into a garage and were using laptop batteries to power a fiberglass sports car that they built, and which Elon then promptly got in and drove around LA. Right. And he said, I want this. I'm going to buy this company. Bought the place from them, and it took them out of terrible debt that they were in. And he proceeded with Tesla then on that basis. Shortly after that, he felt they weren't up to the type of job that he wanted to do, so he fired them. And that wasn't very good. But I spoke to him about it, and I explained to him that, if you want people to spend the rest of the next 30 years hating you, then do what you're doing. On the other hand, give them credit for the fact that they came up with the idea initially of using multiple 6,800 laptop batteries to power a car, and things will be much better. And Elon listened, and he did that. And so they're all very on good terms now, thank heavens. And they all have credit for having started Tesla. And they have, I listened to an interview with Martin Eberhard, and he said, at the moment, Elon is his best friend, and all he's looking at is his value, his shares in Tesla. And he just can't believe it, right. What has happened to his shares in Tesla. Because, of course, they went through the roof, you see. And, so Elon pushed Tesla up to like $1 trillion dollars rather. Yeah. And, so that's that story. So that's how he got into it. But they started off in the beginning, Elon and Kimball, in 1995, when they had this little office that they had. They said they wanted to start a .com company. And they started with, the first thing they started was a city search program where you could find your way. Now, American cities are all like London Square. So, I mean, you can't find anything unless you have a lot of information, because although there's a grid system, there's like hundreds of streets in the grid system. So to find a place is very difficult. So Elon Kimball came up with the idea of a city search, only to find out that there were many people who were doing city search. And so that immediately they realized, wait a minute, I think city search was somebody else's scheme, the name. And they realized, well, that's not going to work. And that's when Elon had this sort of epiphany and decided that the newspapers are going to have to go onto the internet. And I must say that if you want to give Elon credit for anything, I would say you have to give him credit for that. Because in 1995, anyone who had sort of approached, let's say, the newspapers here and said, look, you're going to have to go on the internet, I mean, they would have laughed at you, I mean, I remember, as a matter of fact, much later, in about 2006, as I've always had Rolls Royces. I happen to like Rolls Royces, but I've always had older ones anyway. But anyway, I've had them. And I got hold of Rolls Royce, and I said to them in about 2006, you're going to have an electric Rolls-Royce, and Rolls-Royce is highly suited to being an electric car. Of course, they just ignored me and they said, thanks for your advice, but no thanks. And they were very nice, gentlemen, but they said, no thanks. Of course, now they're looking to try and build an electric car.
Right.
Rolls-Royce. A little bit late, but anyway, they're trying to do it. But at any rate, so Elon had this foresight to realize that everything is going to be online. And, things are so online now that if you went to buy a newspaper where I live, it's about 3 pages. It's about 4 pages. I don't know what's in it. I don't know what's in it.
Well, they've just stopped doing the Evening Standard over here, apart from sort of once a week.
There's nothing in it.
I think this is, as you say, online is the new frontline, isn't it? They're working on that sort of basis, which is interesting.
Well, if you want to know anything, you go straight online.
Yeah,
surely.
I think that's the interesting thing about all of this. It's just the way that things evolve, but also understanding that that's the pattern, if you like, because working on that sort of basis.
So, I never thought of that. Well, and of course, right now, there's somebody who must be thinking of the future as well.
Yes.
Right. I mean, I never had any thought of self-driving motor cars. It never occurred to me. A self-driving motor car. What's that? Yes. And suddenly, Elon has this idea, we've got to have cars that drive by themselves. This was years ago, 2012. And, the funny thing is, and I arrived in Denver in 2016.
Right.
And it was actually 2015, end of 2015, starting 2016. And I was picked up at the airport. My one daughter came with me from South Africa, and the other daughter was with my son, Kimball, who picked us up there in a new Tesla sort of sports car, sporting version of the Model S. And we got into this car. It was, as I say, December 2015. And Kimball said to me, Dad, look at this. I was sitting next to Kimball in the front seat. And without holding the steering wheel, but his hands under the steering wheel, cupped under the steering wheel, the car withdrew itself from the parking lot of the Denver airport, drove all by itself to the exit, chose the correct exit. He then exited the airport, and it drove us to a special road that had been put in where you could, at that time, travel faster. The limit speed limit was 75. You pay for that road like a toll road, but you don't have to be 60 miles an hour, you can go 75.
Right.
And at that time, and the car took us onto that road and only warned us towards Boulder, which was the city we were heading for, 45 miles away, that there are roadworks ahead, please take over. And the car, then he took over. Then after the roadworks, the car resumed control and took us all the way back to his home in Boulder, drove us into, not into a garage, but into a parking space at his house. And he said, that's our self-driving. And that was, how long ago was that? That's 8 years ago.
Yes, no, it is incredible.
He said, we're still testing it. So that's why his hands were cupped under the steering wheel all the time. But we're still testing it. So at the moment, I think the problem is getting, approval for these sort of things. And of course, there has been a lot of cars being used on autopilot, and accidents have occurred because people reading books and things like that. And it says, like, in any thing like that with an aircraft, which you have an autopilot or something, says, doesn't mean you can go and have a cup of coffee when you're flying an aircraft and it's on autopilot. It means you have to sit and watch the autopilot, And in the same way, when they sold these cars, they said you can go on automatic or auto drive, but you have to say alert. And some people, unfortunately, didn't do that. Yeah. But there are a lot of people using that facility. We have cars in America that have the auto facility. We generally don't use it because most of the time we like driving. So,
but that's the thing, isn't it? It's sort of leisure activity as well. I know you and I, we both like our cars, and I think the old classic ones, you don't want to get rid of those because it's a leisure activity in addition.
Yes, it takes your mind. It's actually a restorative sort of thing to do. I mean, I remember my dad, I think, would have said to me if I was in a state or something, I think he said, or my mum, go for a drive.
Right.
I said, what do you mean? Where am I supposed to drive to? Just go for a drive.
Yeah.
And, you'd go for a drive somewhere and you'd come back, you'd feel all right. You'd be back in form, sort of thing. I think that's true.
No, I think you're right. They're probably also going to have to change the driving tests, aren't they, when you start getting these automated cars? Because it's a different skill, if you like, is you let them take over, but you've got to stay alert just in case. There's always got to be a human override, doesn't
Well,
there?
I sold it. I had a Mercedes V12, and it's a V12 Mercedes has got a self-driving facility where it won't steer for you, but it will stop you in traffic. It will control your movement in traffic. You don't have to touch the accelerator. And I use that quite a lot. But I did, on occasion, discover that when I was coming up to a point where the auto drive, or whatever it's called, was meant to stop me, it had switched off.
Right.
And luckily I was able to stop.
Right.
So if I hadn't done that, I would have gone straight into everybody, because it stopped and went on according to the traffic. And you have the same thing in aircraft. Aircraft, I've had many aircraft, and so most of them have, nearly all of them have an autopilot these days. So you get different kinds of autopilots, 2-axis, 3-axis, and all that sort of stuff. But you have to keep an eye on it, because it's just the sort of thing that happens is that the moment you decide I'll bend down and see what's under my seat in the aircraft, look for my lost pen or something like that, that's the very moment that the autopilot will say, hey, I think I'll stop working.
Yeah.
And then when you look up again, you're upside down.
Yes.
Or rather nearly upside down. That's happened to me.
And that's the problem, isn't it? Because when you're introducing any new technology, it's all about getting trust. And I always say, look, trust comes in on foot, but leaves on horseback. And you hear about these accidents, and it sort of puts people off to start with. So it's that sort of test, isn't it? Make sure that you get that comfort. Make sure that people get trained accordingly. And you went on some of the you went to see the first ever SpaceX, for example, and we talked about, so you've got astronauts, you've got various members of the public are now going for the first ever spacewalk. Is that something you would do? Is that something you would trust?
Oh, look, I mean, SpaceX is the best. I mean, the quality and standards that SpaceX have is, I don't know, from an engineering point of view and from a sort of technical perfection point of view, you just can't believe. And the reason is that the boys and girls that are in there, and they are boys and girls, are so dedicated, are so I mean, they're not all tech maths fundies. Some of them are sort of human relation, whatever. But they're all so totally dedicated to the to SpaceX, and they brought their brilliance together. And it's got to be an exercise in probably one of the best companies, the most perfect companies that have ever been created. Mainly also because what they're doing doesn't allow you don't get second chances.
Right.
It's not like you can have another go. Let's try. Okay, it didn't work. Let's try again. It doesn't work. You only get one chance. And so what they've achieved is marvelous. I mean, absolutely marvelous. They've done in a very short time. You take the spacewalk, for example. That was something that the Russians and the Americans, and I imagine I don't think the European community, but anyway, spent years trying to achieve a spacewalk. And SpaceX does it, just like that. And with people who haven't spent years and years flying jet aircraft or anything like that, but in fact have been behind a desk most of their lives. And that's the way it should be. You should be able to do that. And that's otherwise, what's the point?
Yeah.
And so the next thing is, of course, getting the Starship up and running. And it's hard. It's a very hard thing. Elon is, people who ask me, is Elon happy? And I mean, of course he's happy, in a way. But I mean, he would like to be where he is now with SpaceX maybe 5 years ago or 6 years ago. I think he's fairly happy with Tesla. I think he'd like the auto self-driving to have taken off by now. But generally, I'd say SpaceX is the thing that he would have liked to have seen, because, you see, we tend to measure things in terms of our own lives.
Right.
I mean, a lifespan is like supposedly 70. So, I mean, he's 53 now. So, and he's got to do that, what he has in mind, before his time is up. And that's a problem. If he had another 100 years, well, he could sort of sit back and take his time. But unfortunately, he can't. So, you want to get on with it so that it can happen in his lifetime. Let's put it like that.
It is phenomenal, the seismic changes that have happened in our lifetime just in the last few years, and Elon has been right at the forefront and center of that. What he's also been at the forefront and center is getting involved with politics, and we looked at that sort of side, and as well as the various run-ins with people, because his glorious sense of humor doesn't necessarily match everybody else's sense of humor. Sometimes it does get him into trouble. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to be looking at some of the stories that are hitting the headlines and putting those into perspective and getting the truth. Don't touch that dial.